Hello, everyone, and thanks for being here. My name's Paul Strohmeier. I run the Sensory Motor Interaction Group at the Max Planck Institute for Informatics. I'm super humbled to be speaking here amongst all these amazing people, and I'm thankful to Saranga for the invitation. In fact, I clearly remember meeting Saranga the first time at the Augmented Human Conference, where I was an undergraduate research assistant and had just submitted my first poster and was in Singapore, and it was really exciting. And Saranga and Ellen Doe were amazing hosts and kind of made me feel very welcome in this community, as they are doing now too. So thank you for that. As I said, I now run the Sensory Motor Interaction Group at the MPI. And I thought I'd take this opportunity to talk about some of the things that I want to be looking at in my research going forward. A good place of departure might be to think about perception and experience. In the HCI context, we often use these terms interchangeably. So we might talk about, perceiving an object or experiencing an object and not differentiate between these two things very clearly. But doing so can be useful, and I hope to show this better during the course of my talk. One of the ways I think about this is experience. That's kind of what you take with you, while perception is what happens in the moment. And it's perception that I want to be talking about. So the way I think about it, the way I frame it, I think of perception as something that people do. Perception is an activity, and it's a structured activity. And through this activity, we create our world. And it's these three ideas that I'd like to talk about more. I mean, people interested in this whole idea of embodied interaction, they've come about this concept of active perception. So this is nothing new. But I think this is kind of my appeal to take this idea more seriously. None of the things I'm talking about here are new. What I'm doing is I'm taking a bunch of information that most of you already know, and I'm hoping, if I'm successful, I'm going to arrange it in a way that makes you think about things in a new way. So let's start with this idea of active perception. And again, I want to be super literal here. We've all seen these images recorded by Yarbus, where he records the eye movements of people looking at pictures and superimposes them on the pictures. And these are often used as examples of active perception. And I'm doing the same thing here. The face you see and the traces on it are recordings by Yarbus in the 60s. And next to it, there's the recording of eye movements over text that is scrolling upwards as it is being read. So this is kind of the type of activity that we do when we look at stuff. And it would be quite easy to find a counterfactual to my claim. All we need a person who looks at stuff and doesn't move their eyes. And then we can say, well, wait a moment, maybe this idea of active perception isn't that strong. And interestingly, such a person was found. This person is today known by the name of AI. That's all the information about her that I could dig up. And she has, from birth on, the muscles of her eyes are paralyzed, so she cannot move her eyes. Interestingly enough, she can see just fine. And this was surprising, so people studied how does she look at things, and they noticed that she has interesting head movements when looking at objects. So these head movements were recorded, and I'm going to put this side by side. On the left hand, you see the head movements of AI, and on the right hand, you see the eye movements of a healthy seeing person. And what this kind of highlights is that motion is important for seeing. It's so important that this person who was not able to move her eyes found another method of creating motion for seeing. And it turns out it is actually quite similar movement to what people do with their eyes. I find this quite fascinating. Another way of highlighting the importance of movement for perception is this paper here that I really love. The lead author, John K. Stevens, is who we will be talking about. Because, well, here's John K. Stevens. And what's happening here in this paper, they successively paralyze him more. They He's in slight paralysis where he can kind of move his eyes, and over the course of various trials, the paralysis increases and increases until finally he cannot move at all. And the paper is then his report of this paralysis. I kind of imagine a bunch of grad students pulling straws and then one pulling the short one and knowing, well, at least I can be first author. But aside from the fact that this paper is really interesting, there's something else interesting going on, which they kind of mention as a side note. They say, well, in the high paralysis condition, image fading became a real problem. So this guy here, who's supposed to report on visual perception, all of a sudden stops seeing because he can't move. He no longer sees things. But all is good because he's completely paralyzed, so he needs artificial ventilation, and that moves his lung and that moves his face, and then the images come back. So, the paper is saved, we can publish. Kind of as another indicator at how important action is for vision or for perception. None of this should be surprising. We're all familiar with the concept of visual fading, but these two anecdotes kind of highlight the importance. So the other thing that I wanted to bring here is that these perceptive activities, they're not kind of arbitrary. What we have is we expect information to have certain structures and then react to that in our perception. So I brought a bunch of pixels. You see these pixels here. It's probably not super comfortable to look at, and they don't make a whole lot of sense, because I'm showing you these pixels sequentially. If I arrange them in space, all of a sudden the picture will start to appear and you can make sense of it. So visual information is largely the important dimension is the spatial dimension. Let's take some sound as another example. Here I'm playing a bunch of tones at the same time. It's kind of difficult to make out what's happening. But now if I arrange them in time, if I play them sequentially, you can make sense of them and you can understand what is happening with them. So different sensory modalities or different types of information are typically organized in ways that we expect and that we need to make sense of. And I'll kind of get back to that. But the last point that I wanted to make is that perception is creative. And I mean this in the literal sense of the word. Through this activity of perception, we create. And a paper that highlights that in a really cool way is this work by Bensmeier. I really love this paper. It's super cool. So what they did is they put a magnet on a finger, and they have a Hall effect sensor that measures vibration of that magnet, and then they have the finger move over different textures. And what happens is they get these recordings where you kind of have a waveform that shows the vibration or the distance of the magnet to the sensor. Here you see these plotted against time. And then you can transform them and plot the amplitude of the vibration against in the frequency spectrum. And you see that different materials cause different frequency spectrum distributions when they're being touched. Now, Bensmeier and Hollis, they speculated that we perceive textures through the Pacinian system, which is sensitive to vibrations. And what they speculated is that we would perceive textures as similar that have a similar frequency distribution and textures as different that have a different frequency distribution. And that is actually what they found. So we can now quite concisely claim that texture is perceived through vibration, which is really cool. But it creates this very paradox situation where if we look in this case at a piece of wood, it has a texture, but it does not have vibration. And if we look at this fingertip, like my fingertip has a texture, but it doesn't have vibration either. So the thing which we use to perceive texture, it's not there. It's created by us perceiving it. It's created by the activity of perception. So we quite literally create our perception of the world, which I think is super fascinating. So what does that do for HCI? Like, why is this relevant? it guides us towards a way of designing for perception. With haptics, like let's think of a VR setup and we want people to tactually feel their world. One might be tempted to provide, recreate a tactile world and use lots of proxy objects to create what you want the person to experience. But instead of doing that, what you can do is, rather than providing the object that the person should feel, you can provide the stimuli that the person would experience if they were interacting with that object. So the benefit of this, well, it allows us to create very complex sensations with very simple tools. And now I'll loop back to my own research where I've been trying to do this. So this idea of active perception and of perception creating what we experience, if we take it seriously, if we want to create a virtual texture, we might not start with the material and then model this material. We could start with the movement and simply record what the person is doing. So one of the things I've shown in my research is if you create vibration as a function of a movement, and then you modify the parameters of this function, you can create all kinds of different texture experiences without modeling the material, but simply by taking the person's movement and generating vibration based on that movement. I'm not the only one in this area doing this kind of thing. So this is actually closely related to Kuchenbecker's seminal work on texture rendering, but also, or maybe even more closely, to the work by people like Kildall and Lee, who have been working with these virtual compliance sensations. So if you think about the structure of perception, what becomes clear here is that we expect haptic information to be structured relative to our actions. And this can be done in different ways. So I've been mainly working with isotonic actions where you move something in space and then you augment that with vibration. But you could also do that with isometric actions. There's a really nice paper by Wigder and colleagues, and then again, the compliance illusions by Kildall and Lee do this. And you kind of see there's, and then there's elastic elements. So I've been also working with bendy phones. And there's this kind of spectrum of types of movement that can be augmented, which again result in different experiences. Typically, isotonic would become more resistive, while isometric might become a more compliant experience. And this is something that we explored with Jürgen Steimle here at the University of Saarland with a shoe prototype that we augmented with a bunch of sensors and actuators. And what we do here is, as the shoe is kind of moving through the air, we can add resistance, kind of like maybe you're pushing through grass or brush. And as the shoe is placed on the ground, we can add compliance. So you might step on something hard, but we can make it feel kind of soft. And we use that for kind of doing a haptic augmented reality while you're walking around. The implementation of this does something kind of cool. So there's the shoe itself senses what it is doing, and based on that activity, it generates vibration. And then we have a controller which only intermittently sends updates and tells the shoe what to do. So in this example here, Lewis is stepping from the white texture on the kind of wood color texture. And the only information that the computer sends to the shoe is like, oh, now you're moving from texture A to texture B. And everything else kind of happens on the shoe. And this mirrors what I think is important to understand in this kind of creative process of creating our world. We kind of, in HCI, we might have a typical action effect pairing, might be like, oh, I want to turn on the light, and I'll do that, and then the light is turned on. But within this turning on the light, there's also interaction happening, because as I'm pushing the light switch, I feel a counterforce, and I adjust my pushing force to that, so as not to break the light switch, but press strong enough to push it in. And then as it's moving, maybe there's, some sand in it, which is creating resistance. And I might again adjust my pushing towards that. So within these kind of larger HCI-ish, I want this to happen, so I do this action percept loops, you have these tiny embedded perceptive acts where you use perception to understand what's happening. And what I want to do with my research group is I want to explore these perceptive acts. So to put this in context, we might have, there's this kind of like a model of stuff people do by Newell, and he says you can kind of separate activities by their temporal dimensions. And then, Scott McKenzie says, like traditionally, this is the stuff that HCI cares about. And Scott McKenzie also acknowledges, well, with people like Dorisch and Winograd, Suchman, we've also come to appreciate that HCI should deal with kind of much longer time periods. But I think something that is missing, and that actually the people here who are speaking are starting to really explore, is that we should also, there's this perceptive band where perceptive acts happen. And that is kind of where exciting stuff can happen. So we have this, we see this being explored in a lot of the EMS stuff. Maybe Pedro will talk about some of that. And also work on studying agency. And I think this is a really exciting area to explore in HCI. And that's where I'll be going with the research that we'll be doing with the sensory motor interaction group at the Max Planck Institute. Anyway, thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.